My son sold my $4 million ranch without telling me. Then he handed me a $15,000 check and said, "Go live far away from here." I just laughed. He had no idea what I had done a few days earlier. Frank Miller had never been the kind of man who needed much. At 67 years old, he still rose before the sun, poured himself a cup of black coffee in the same chipped mug he'd used for over 2 decades, and walked the perimeter of his ranch with the same boots he'd worn thin over the years. His knees creaked now, and his back wasn't what it used to be, but none of that mattered. The land, stretching over hundreds of acres of Texas soil, had been his life's work. Every fence post, every head of cattle, every field of grazing grass bore the fingerprints of Frank's effort. He wasn't born into wealth. In fact, the house he was raised in had dirt floors and a tin roof that clanged like thunder whenever it rained. But his father, a World War II veteran, taught him something far more valuable than money: the dignity of hard work. Frank took that lesson to heart. He started with 30 acres and a broken tractor. Over the decades, he turned it into a thriving $4 million ranch, a name known and respected in every county line it touched. His wife, Lillian, had been his heart. They met at a county fair when Frank was just 22. She laughed at his boots being 2 sizes too big and danced with him anyway. For 36 years, she stood by him, raised their only son, and helped build a home from dust. When she died 11 years ago, something in Frank went quiet. He still did the work, still made his rounds, still kept the house clean, but the music had stopped. Only Brandon remained. Brandon Miller, 35, had never shared his father's love for ranching. As a boy, he trailed behind Frank for a while, carrying feed buckets or helping herd cattle when told. But his interests were always elsewhere: city life, technology, dreams of a lifestyle that didn't require dirt under his nails. Frank tried to understand, even when it hurt. He paid for Brandon's education, supported him when he wanted to move to Austin, and never once complained when the boy stopped calling as often. But time changes things. About a year ago, Brandon returned to the ranch. Said he needed a fresh start. Frank welcomed him with cautious optimism. Maybe, he thought, his son had finally come around. Maybe he'd seen the value in the life his father built. They sat on the porch some nights, just like old times, drinking tea and watching the horizon melt into orange and blue. Still, there were signs, moments when Brandon's phone conversations would suddenly end when Frank entered the room. Emails closed too quickly. A persistent curiosity about paperwork, ownership documents, the financials of the ranch. Frank noticed. He wasn't a fool. He had built this place with more than sweat, he had built it with instinct. And something in his gut told him that change was coming. Frank didn't say anything, not yet. He'd learned over the years that silence could be more powerful than words. So he waited. Observed. Paid attention to the small things, the way Brandon avoided eye contact when money came up, the way he flinched when Frank mentioned legacy or the future of the ranch. There was distance between them, invisible but real. But Frank held on to hope. Maybe his son was simply adjusting. Maybe he needed time to see the value in the life his father had lived. After all, this wasn't just land, it was history. The barn held memories of laughter and storms weathered. The kitchen table had seen birthdays, mourning, and late-night strategy sessions about cattle breeds and crop rotation. Every nail in every beam told a story. One afternoon, Frank found Brandon sitting alone in the old shed, staring out at the pasture. The air was heavy, like the stillness before a Texas thunderstorm. Frank sat beside him, said nothing at first. "I know this life isn't what you wanted," he finally said, his voice calm but sure. "But it's been good to us." Brandon nodded, silent. Frank stood, patted his son on the back, and walked away. He didn't look back. But something in that moment stayed with him, a feeling, sharp and cold, that something wasn't right. It wasn't just disinterest anymore. It was something else. A decision had been made, and Frank wasn't sure it was one he would like. Still, he kept to his routine. He fed the horses, mended the fencing, and kept the ledgers up to date. The days rolled on, the sunsets just as stunning, the silence between father and son just as loud. Frank Miller, ranchero of the Texas Plains, didn't yet know the storm was closer than he thought. But in his heart, he felt the wind shifting. The land that had given him everything was about to be tested, and so was the bond with the only family he had left. He looked out over the pasture one evening, just as the sun slipped behind the hills, and whispered to himself, "You don't spend a lifetime building something just to watch it disappear." Little did he know, Brandon had already made his move. The day started like any other, a pale, golden dawn casting long shadows across the dew-covered grass, the familiar scent of hay and earth filling the air. Frank Miller had just saddled up his horse, Blue, for a routine ride along the fence line when he noticed the first sign that something was off. A black SUV, far too polished for these roads, rolled up the long dirt driveway with slow, deliberate purpose. Moments later, another vehicle followed, a flatbed truck with out-of-state plates, hauling equipment Frank didn't recognize. Frank dismounted, narrowing his eyes as he watched two men step out. Both wore pressed khakis and designer sunglasses that didn't belong anywhere near a ranch. One of them held a clipboard. The other started snapping photos of the barn from different angles. Frank approached, boots crunching over gravel. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his tone firm but measured. The man with the clipboard turned, smiled too wide. "Morning, sir. Just doing some preliminary assessments. Beautiful property you've got here." Frank glanced at the truck again. "Assessments for what?" Before the man could answer, Brandon's voice echoed from the house. "Hey. It's all right, Dad. They're with me." Frank turned slowly. Brandon was standing on the porch, phone in hand, grinning as if nothing was out of the ordinary. He waved dismissively and spoke again, this time into the phone. Yeah, the team's already here. We're right on schedule." Frank's eyes lingered on his son. Something in his gut clenched, but he said nothing. He simply turned back to Blue, mounted up, and rode toward the west field. He needed distance, not just to think, but to breathe. Later that evening, as the sky melted into hues of tangerine and violet, Frank walked back toward the house. The crew was gone. The trucks had disappeared. Brandon sat on the porch swing, scrolling through his phone. Frank stepped onto the wooden planks and stood silently, arms crossed. After a long pause, Brandon finally looked up. "We need to talk," he said. Frank nodded, waiting. Brandon leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice casual, too casual. "Dad, you've worked hard your whole life. No one's saying otherwise. But this ranch, it's a lot. You've earned your rest." Frank's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" Brandon sighed, as if explaining something obvious. "I've sold it. The ranch. I finalized everything this week. The buyers are ready to take over in a couple of days." Silence fell like a hammer. "You what?" Frank asked, low and slow. "I sold the ranch," Brandon repeated, standing up now. "You're always saying how hard it is to keep up with things. And let's face it, this isn't your world anymore. You deserve comfort, peace. I'm giving that to you." Frank stepped closer, jaw tight. "This land isn't yours to sell." Brandon reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Legally, I had the authority. You signed the paperwork years ago. Remember? To make estate matters easier after Mom passed?" Frank took the envelope but didn't open it. His eyes stayed fixed on Brandon. "It's $15,000, Brandon continued. Enough for you to get yourself set up somewhere quiet. Maybe Nevada. Or New Mexico. Somewhere with less stress. Less history." Frank didn't flinch. Didn't move. Just stared at his son, face unreadable. "I'm not kicking you out, Dad," Brandon added quickly. "I'm giving you freedom. You've earned it." Frank finally opened the envelope, glanced at the check, then folded it and slid it into his shirt pocket without a word. He turned and walked back inside, leaving Brandon alone with his rationalizations and rehearsed kindness. Inside the house, the air felt colder. Frank stood in the kitchen for a moment, his fingers brushing the edge of the old dining table. He looked at the wall where Lillian's favorite photo hung, her sitting on the fence post, laughing at something Frank had said. He closed his eyes for a moment, let the silence settle around him. He didn't rage. Didn't curse. He just sat down, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small black notebook. In it, he'd scribbled details over the past several months, names, dates, suspicions. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Brandon finalized sale. Confirmed today. Time to move." He wasn't surprised. Not really. He'd seen the signs. But hearing it said out loud, the audacity of it, it settled into his bones like winter frost. Frank didn't sleep that night. Instead, he poured himself a small glass of bourbon and sat on the back porch under the stars, listening to the hum of crickets and the distant calls of coyotes. Around 2 in the morning, he opened his phone and dialed a number from memory. After 3 rings, a tired voice answered. "Tom Richardson." "It's me," Frank said. Tom was silent for a moment. Then, "So it happened." "Yup. I assume the envelope arrived. Just tonight." Another pause. "You ready to make your move?" Tom asked. Frank looked out over the darkness, the fields barely visible under moonlight. "I already did," he replied. He hung up and stood, stretching his sore back. Before going back inside, he took the check from his pocket, looked at it again, then quietly dropped it into the trash bin by the porch steps. The next morning, Brandon was gone. No note, no goodbye, just his truck missing from the gravel driveway. Frank didn't bother looking for him. Instead, he made a call to a man named Harold Denton. Then, he fed the horses. The wind had changed. Something was coming. And Frank, with a calm born of 67 hard years, was ready to meet it. 3 days before Brandon handed him the check and declared the ranch sold, Frank Miller was already moving pieces behind the curtain. It had started with a quiet breakfast, eggs over easy, toast without butter, black coffee, the kind of breakfast that gave a man time to think. He'd been watching Brandon for weeks, pretending not to notice the quiet phone calls or the sudden visits to town that he never explained. But Frank wasn't just a rancher. He was a survivor. And survivors paid attention. That morning, after rinsing his plate and wiping down the counter the way Lillian used to, Frank drove his old Ford pickup into town. He didn't go to the feed store or the hardware shop. Instead, he parked 2 blocks from the courthouse and walked to a brick building with a brass plaque that read, "Richardson and Bloom, Attorneys at Law." He didn't have an appointment, but that didn't matter. Tom Richardson had always made time for Frank. Tom was in his late 70s, a legal veteran with sharp eyes and a dry sense of humor. He'd handled Frank's estate planning after Lillian passed, and Frank trusted him more than anyone. When he walked into Tom's office, the old man looked up from his reading glasses and leaned back. "Well, if it ain't the ghost of Miller Ranch. What brings you in, Frank?" Frank didn't smile. He closed the door behind him and sat down. "I need to transfer some land." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You finally retiring?" "Not exactly," Frank replied. "I need to move 75% of the ranch into a holding fund. Beneficiaries already picked, the Texas Veteran Support Foundation." Tom blinked, clearly caught off guard. "That's a big move, Frank. That's not something you do on a whim." "I've been thinking about it longer than you know," Frank said. "I want it done quietly, and I want it done right. No press, no buzz. Just paperwork and a signature." Tom leaned forward. "Brandon know about this?" Frank's jaw tightened. "He doesn't need to." Tom didn't press. He knew better than to question Frank when his voice took that tone. Instead, he opened a folder and started drafting the necessary paperwork. "All right. We'll set up a restricted charitable trust. You'll retain full operational control, and the foundation becomes the majority beneficiary. That'll make it damn near impossible for anyone to sell it off without your direct involvement. That's what I want, Frank said. I don't mind giving him a share down the line, but not like this. Not while he's playing games. Tom nodded. We'll file today. It'll be finalized in 48 hours. Frank looked out the window, watching the branches sway in the early autumn wind. Good. Then the rest can play out however it needs to. But Frank hadn't just stopped there. After leaving Tom's office, he stopped at a small electronics store on the edge of town. He paid cash for 3 miniature recording devices, the kind marketed for home security, but popular among those needing quiet surveillance. Back at the ranch that night, while Brandon was on yet another phone call in the living room, Frank worked in silence. He planted one device under the table in the dining room. Another in the barn's tack room. The third, he embedded inside the old wall clock hanging near the office desk, a clock Brandon never gave a second glance. For 2 days, Frank said nothing and waited. He kept up appearances, fed the animals, mended a fence line with a pair of worn gloves, and even joined Brandon for coffee one morning as if nothing was amiss. But each evening, when the house went quiet, he sat in the study with his old laptop and listened to what the devices had picked up. The recordings weren't crystal clear, but the intent behind Brandon's words was unmistakable. Told you, he won't be a problem. He still thinks he owns the place. Signed everything years ago. Doesn't even remember. Trust me, he's too old to fight it. Cash clears Monday. After that, we're gone. Each clip confirmed what Frank already knew in his bones. Brandon hadn't just made a mistake, he'd orchestrated a betrayal. The timing, the manipulation, the confidence in his father's supposed ignorance, it all stung more than Frank expected. Not just because Brandon had sold the ranch, but because he believed his father was too blind, too slow, too old to notice. Frank saved the audio files, labeled them, and backed them up onto a secure USB drive which he stored in the old tin box behind the bookshelf. He added printed transcripts, notarized copies of the trust agreement, and a letter addressed to the Texas Attorney General, sealed but ready, just in case things escalated further. On the third day, the day Brandon would later hand him the check, Frank stood out near the north pasture, staring at the horizon. It was early, still cool, the sky painted with streaks of blue and rose. Blue grazed nearby, flicking his ears lazily, unaware of the tension humming through his owner's veins. Frank turned slowly when he heard the gravel shift under tires. Brandon's truck was pulling up fast, dust trailing behind. The door slammed shut, and Brandon called out. Hey! You out here? Frank didn't answer. He waited until Brandon was close enough to speak without yelling. Got something to talk to you about, Brandon said, walking up with his usual swagger. Big news. Frank didn't smile. He just nodded, slow and heavy. Go on then. But Brandon hesitated. His rehearsed lines suddenly stuck in his throat. Something in his father's face had changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something colder, a kind of knowing calm that unsettled him. Still, he pushed forward. Let's go inside. Got something I want you to see. Frank didn't move. He kept his eyes on the horizon. You can say it right here. Brandon faltered for a moment, then reached into his jacket, pulled out the envelope, and handed it over with the same fake confidence he'd used in a dozen bad deals. Frank took it. Said nothing. Well? Brandon asked. You surprised? Frank looked up at him, the lines on his face deeper than usual. Not even a little. Then he turned, walked toward the barn, and left his son standing alone in the dust. Back inside, Frank tucked the envelope into his pocket and sat at the desk. He opened the drawer, removed the USB, and looked at it for a long moment. It wasn't just about land anymore. It wasn't about the money or the betrayal. It was about the fact that somewhere along the way, the boy he'd raised had learned to take, not earn. And Frank Miller wasn't about to let that kind of lesson go unchallenged. By sundown, Harold Denton had already returned his call. And Frank was ready. While Frank moved with precision and quiet foresight, Brandon operated with the clumsy confidence of a man who believed himself smarter than everyone around him. After all, he had what he thought was the perfect cover: a father too old to understand modern finance, a property tucked away from the eyes of regulators, and a circle of enablers who either didn't care about ethics or were too easily impressed by the size of the payday. But beneath the surface of his bold maneuver was a rushed and reckless scheme, stitched together with falsified signatures, borrowed names, and a brazen hope that nothing would catch up to him. After leaving the ranch on the day he gave Frank the check, Brandon didn't head back to the motel where he had been staying. Instead, he drove straight to Austin, where he met up with Camille, his girlfriend of 2 years. Camille was younger, sharp, and just as ambitious, but where Brandon was manipulative, Camille was strategic. She had a background in marketing, a few connections in the West Coast tech scene, and dreams of launching a lifestyle app aimed at digital nomads. The money from the ranch sale, they believed, would be the seed that would turn them into startup royalty. In the corner booth of a dimly lit bar near 6th Street, Brandon spread out a stack of papers in front of Camille. His tone was smug as he explained. "It's done," he said. "The buyers wired the funds. And as far as the title office knows, everything's clean." Camille looked through the pages, skimming the names and stamps. "And your dad? He's really out of the picture?" Brandon nodded. "I gave him a check for 15 grand. Told him to go live somewhere quiet. He took it. Didn't even argue. Man still thinks the world works on handshakes and trust." She raised an eyebrow. "What about legal oversight? Texas property transfers require signature authentication, don't they?" Brandon grinned. "I covered that. Found a notary in El Paso willing to certify a remote authorization. Name's not even real. Paid cash. As far as the system shows, Frank Miller signed everything." Camille leaned back, clearly impressed but cautious. "Still sounds risky. What if he pushes back?" "He won't," Brandon said, with a dismissive wave. "Even if he wanted to, he'd have to undo a transaction that's already cleared. By the time anyone looks twice, we'll be in San Diego with an LLC and an app beta already out." She didn't reply right away. Instead, she reached into her purse, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the table. "Then let's move fast. Here's the proposal draft and the list of potential angel investors. We need the funds in a clean account by Monday. You wire them, and I'll take it from there." Brandon took the folder, nodding. But a flicker of anxiety crossed his face. It wasn't Frank he worried about, it was the buyer. The buyer, a man named Robert McKinley, was a California developer with a reputation for turning ranches into luxury retreats. He was slick, well-dressed, and extremely impatient. The deal had gone through only because Brandon promised immediate, uncontested ownership. Any legal hiccups, and McKinley would flip, and not just verbally. So, Brandon made another call, this time to a contact named Victor Lin, a consultant he'd met during a networking event in Houston. "Victor," Brandon said when the line connected. "I need some insurance. McKinley might get twitchy once he starts looking too closely. Can you manage the optics?" Victor's voice was calm. "Depends what you need managed. Just need a temporary firewall. If anything gets flagged in title verification, I want it delayed. Give us a 2-week window before anything hits the legal pipeline." Victor chuckled. "That's not cheap." "I just closed a 7-figure deal," Brandon replied. "Money's not the issue." "All right," Victor said. "Send the title office number and the file reference. I'll buy you some time." With that, Brandon leaned back in his seat, the edges of his mouth twitching upward in self-satisfaction. He truly believed he had pulled it off. In his mind, he wasn't just beating the system, he was outsmarting the very man who had built the system he was exploiting. Meanwhile, back in Texas, the buyer's representatives had already started to ask questions. One of McKinley's attorneys, a sharp woman named Allison Reyes, had flagged inconsistencies in the signature dates and noticed that the notary used in the deal was registered under a closed license. It was the first thread in a fabric that would soon begin to unravel. Reyes called McKinley directly. "Sir," she said, "there's something strange about this file. The authorization for sale is dated 3 days before the notary's registration ended. Also, I can't find a digital certificate associated with their stamp. It could be nothing, but it could be everything," McKinley said, finishing her sentence. He didn't like surprises. Especially not legal ones. And he especially didn't like being made to look foolish. "Put a hold on any development plans," he ordered. "And send someone to verify the title in person. I want boots on the ground. Today." Brandon had no idea that wheels were already turning, wheels beyond his control. That same night, Camille noticed he was quieter than usual. "You all right?" she asked as they checked into a boutique hotel under her name. "Yeah," he replied. "Just thinking through next steps." She tilted her head. "You sure this isn't going to blow back on you?" He didn't answer right away. "It won't," he finally said. "It can't." But deep down, there was a sliver of doubt now, something small, like a seed buried beneath bravado and ego. It was the same feeling he'd had when he'd forged his father's name, when he'd pressed down on the notary stamp with shaky hands, hoping no one would check. What Brandon didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that by the time he said the words, "It can't," Frank Miller had already secured the legal documents that would render the entire transaction invalid. Frank wasn't in the dark. He wasn't behind. He was ahead, and Brandon was walking straight into a storm. Late on a quiet Sunday evening, while the hum of the cicadas filled the air outside the old barn, Frank Miller knelt beneath the farthest corner of the structure, behind a stack of weathered hay bales and a rusting wheelbarrow, and pried up a loose wooden plank. The wood creaked, reluctant, like it remembered being placed there decades ago. Beneath it, nestled in a shallow cavity in the dirt floor, sat a black, dust-covered metal box the size of a small suitcase. Frank wiped it clean with the edge of his sleeve, fingers moving carefully over the old lock mechanism as if greeting an old friend. This was the safe no one knew about, not even Lillian, though she had likely suspected something was hidden out there. Frank had built it with the help of a local welder nearly 30 years earlier, back when they'd expanded the barn after a flood damaged the original structure. At the time, it had seemed excessive. But Frank had always believed in being prepared. Over the years, the safe became a place for the most important things: original property deeds, letters of credit, land surveys, old wills, a revolver with 2 boxes of ammunition, and more recently, documents tied to the Veterans Trust. Frank twisted the dial, entered the code by memory, and lifted the lid. Inside, everything was just as he had left it, dry, sealed in clear bags, meticulously labeled. On top of the stack lay a slim digital recorder, one of the 3 he had retrieved the night before. He had spent hours reviewing the audio from Brandon's conversations, isolating the ones that mattered most, and saving them as individual files. He had also printed transcripts, careful to include timestamps and speaker identification. There was no need to exaggerate or embellish. The truth, raw and unfiltered, was damning enough. He added another envelope to the safe that night, containing a signed affidavit from Tom Richardson confirming the timeline of the property transfer to the trust. The affidavit was dated, notarized, and backed by copies of every related document, enough to disprove any claim Brandon could make. Frank also included photos of Brandon meeting with the buyer's team, taken from a distance by a private investigator Frank had quietly hired 2 weeks earlier, just to be sure his suspicions weren't the result of old age and paranoia. Once everything was in place, Frank resealed the safe, replaced the plank, and left the barn without a word. The weight of the situation pressed on him, but he carried it with the same quiet resolve that had guided him through storms, droughts, and death. This wasn't just a legal battle now. It was a reckoning, one that would test everything he had ever believed about family, legacy, and trust. The next morning, Frank met with Harold Denton in the back room of a small diner 2 towns over, a discreet spot they'd agreed upon. Denton arrived wearing jeans and a casual flannel shirt, his demeanor relaxed but sharp-eyed as always. He carried a thick folder under one arm and a battered leather briefcase in the other. "I reviewed the files last night," Harold said as he slid into the booth. "You weren't exaggerating. This thing's airtight on your end." Frank nodded slowly, sipping black coffee. "And on his?" "Shoddy. Kid's reckless. Falsified notary signature, out-of-state buyer, forged parental consent, manipulated title documentation. He was smart enough to plan, dumb enough to leave fingerprints on every step." Frank's lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but something grimmer. "And the buyer?" "Robert McKinley," Denton replied, pulling out a sheet. "He's already in panic mode. His legal team flagged inconsistencies, and from what I hear, he's trying to pause the wire transfer and lock down liability. That helps us. Means he's not backing Brandon. Did he know about the fraud? Unclear. But even if he didn't, he's exposed now. If he pushes back, we go public. He knows that." Frank folded his hands on the table. "Let's file the injunction." Harold nodded and passed over a draft of the court order. "We'll get a temporary injunction by end of day. After that, I'll initiate a formal petition to reverse the transaction and freeze the funds." "Do it." The next step was communication. Not to Brandon, not yet, but to the county assessor's office and the regional land registry. Frank wanted every file touched by Brandon to be flagged and cross-checked. He knew his son. Brandon wouldn't stop just because he'd been paid. He'd already started positioning himself for the next step, the startup, the investors, the new life built on stolen ground. Frank's role now was to hold that ground firm. That afternoon, Frank returned to the barn to retrieve the second recorder. He played the final conversation Brandon had with Camille before leaving for Austin. It was short, no more than 4 minutes, but revealing. "He doesn't even realize what he signed years ago. He gave me power of attorney back when Mom died. That's what gave me the opening." Camille's voice followed, "But are you sure it still holds? That was over a decade ago." "It doesn't matter," Brandon said confidently. "It was never revoked. And no one's gonna dig that deep." Frank paused the playback. He remembered the document, power of attorney, granted after Lillian's passing during a particularly vulnerable time. It was supposed to be temporary, to help manage hospital bills and estate claims. But the clause Brandon referenced didn't give him full authority over asset sales without Frank's explicit consent. Denton had already reviewed it and confirmed, it was insufficient. Still, Brandon's belief in its power said everything about how he viewed his father, as weak, incapable, easy to maneuver. But Brandon had forgotten something essential. Frank hadn't survived wars with the land, the market, and the weather by being easy to maneuver. He'd survived because he always knew the right moment to act, and the right way to prepare. That night, Frank made one more entry in his black notebook. Buyer's attorney alerted. Injunction in process. Safe contains full audit trail. Brandon still doesn't know. He underlined that last sentence. Still doesn't know. And that was how Frank wanted it, for now. The moment the injunction was filed, Frank Miller entered a new phase of quiet dominance. The writ had landed with the legal equivalent of a thunderclap. The sale was officially halted, the buyer's funds frozen, the title flagged. Now the question was not whether the transaction could be reversed, but how quickly. Meanwhile, in a gray-walled office in the county courthouse, a man in a tailored suit sat behind a massive oak desk reviewing the documentation with crisp detachment. His name was Harold Denton, or rather, one of his associates, Thomas Grant, acting under Denton's direction. Grant had been tapped to present Frank's case before the judge, and he bore the weight of responsibility with professional calm. A young clerk knocked and entered, placing a stack of papers in front of him. Grant glanced at them, court filings from the county assessor's office, flagged title records, notarized affidavits, transcripts of dialogues. All evidence pointed to a fraudulent sale orchestrated by none other than Brandon Miller. Grant's phone buzzed. It was Harold from the diner earlier that morning. "How are we standing?" Harold asked. "Solid," Grant replied. the title registry threw a red flag. The buyer's team is nervous. If we keep the evidence tidy, the judge will rule in under 24 hours. Good, Harold said. Make sure to emphasize the trust foundation and the valid transfer to the veterans organization. Already in the petition, Grant confirmed. He wrapped up the call and prepared his opening statement. As he rehearsed the narrative in his head, Frank's legacy, the sudden and suspicious sale, the careful legal groundwork Frank had laid, he felt the fragile balance tilting in their favor. Back at the ranch, Frank moved through his day with the same deliberate quiet that had carried him this far. He walked the perimeter, checked fences, and paused by the barn. The hay-laden air was thick with the memory of generations. He thought of the safe beneath the floorboards, the last line in his arsenal, and how the truth rested inside it, waiting. That afternoon, Grant arrived at the sheriff's office to serve notice on both Brandon and the buyer. Brandon received it first. He was at a coffee shop, savoring a latte and reviewing investor emails when a deputy approached, handing him the court documents. Brandon scanned the words with horror creeping into his eyes. Sale annulled pending full court review. All real property transfers executed without mutual agreement invalid. Litigation initiated for cause of fraud and forgery. He looked around, as if unsure the words were real. Panic glimmered behind his eyes. The stage he'd built, the startup, the new life, the escape plan, was collapsing faster than he could salvage it. Grant also tracked down McKinley's representatives, delivering the injunction package. The development mogul was livid and demanded answers. His lawyer, a sharp woman in a gray suit, called Frank directly and left a terse message. We understand there's a court order, but expect communication. We intend to collaborate to minimize collateral damage. Frank didn't respond that day. Instead, he met with Denton again that evening in a quiet office at the back of town. Denton nodded approvingly. We've routed their panic, he said. Now we go for the reversal. Frank leaned his elbows on the table. We've got what matters. Evidence, witnesses, legal control. We move when we can regain full ownership. And then? Frank took a breath. Then I decide what happens to Brandon. Meanwhile, in a rented apartment in Austin, Brandon was dismantling his life. He had logged onto his investor portal to find all accounts frozen. Emails from potential backers went unopened. Camille tried to convince him to sell, roll what he could salvage, but his mind churned in terror, anger, and regret. He turned the tables on me, Brandon said, voice hoarse. He knew. Camille's face reddened. We need a plan. You can't just sit here waiting to be destroyed. But Brandon knew better. He sank into his chair, staring at the screen where apps, funds, and futures vanished in real time. Back in Frank's world, the judge reviewed Denton's filings, the trust documents, the recordings, the notarized affidavits, the flagged title. Eyes narrowed, the judge saw the uneven power in Frank's foresight. It was more than clear. Brandon's sale was not simply questionable, it was illegal. Later that evening, Grant called Frank with news. We won, he said. Temporary injunction converted to a permanent hold. County records are being updated as we speak. The title is in your name again, pending forensic audit. Frank exhaled, a deep, relieved breath. Hope and justice had converged. But the fight wasn't over. Now Brandon would face consequences, legal, emotional, perhaps even physical, in the harsh glare of a community betrayed. Frank walked outside into the night air, the land around him breathing in the cool dark. It had been a long road to reach this point, and the path ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear, he had fought not just to preserve a piece of earth, but to protect legacy, honor, and the truth. The next move belonged to Brandon. The days that followed the injunction were marked by a thick, unspoken tension that wrapped itself around every corner of the Miller Ranch. Frank spoke little, if at all. He followed his routine, early mornings, long walks along the pastures, quiet evenings on the porch, but every step now carried the weight of a silent war. No one in town had yet approached him directly, but he could feel the shift. Word was spreading. People were whispering. The community that had once watched him with quiet respect now watched with something else, cautious curiosity, and maybe even fear. It didn't bother him. He knew the storm wasn't over, and that silence was sometimes the best armor. The legal machinery was still turning behind the scenes, and Harold Denton had warned him not to speak publicly about the case. The reversal had bought them time, but not finality. Brandon's forged transaction hadn't just violated personal trust, it had triggered investigations into the title office, into the notary stamp he used, and into the financial transfers connected to McKinley's firm. The ripple was widening. Brandon, for his part, hadn't returned to the ranch. Not yet. Frank suspected he was still in Austin, reeling. But the younger Miller wasn't idle. On a gray Wednesday afternoon, Harold called from his office with a clipped tone. "He's hired counsel," he said. Frank, who was fixing the latch on the western corral gate, barely glanced up. "Expected that." Trying to play the sympathy card, Harold added. "Claims emotional distress. Said the whole thing stems from unresolved trauma, pressure, a lack of clear guidance. He's painting himself as confused, not malicious." Frank let the hammer hang loosely at his side. "And they'll believe that? In a civil court?" Harold said. "It'll depend on the judge. But we're not going to let it get there. I've filed a countersuit, misrepresentation, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. And we've also subpoenaed the fake notary and the title agency. Your recordings are gold." Frank nodded, tightening the last bolt on the latch. "Let him spin his stories. I'll stick to facts." That night, Frank sat at the old kitchen table and reviewed the latest documentation from Grant. He didn't bother with the legalese, he trusted Denton to handle that. But he made careful note of one particular letter, a written statement from the Texas Veteran Support Foundation, confirming their receipt of ownership and their intent to preserve the land in partnership with Frank. It wasn't just legal defense, it was reputation, rooted in purpose. The foundation's public stance meant the land couldn't be quietly sold off again, not without federal scrutiny. Meanwhile, inside the dimly lit law office in downtown Austin, Brandon sat with his newly appointed attorney, a man named Craig Hollingsworth. Polished, well-spoken, and practiced in courtroom theater, Craig was confident they still had leverage. "You've got plausible deniability," Craig said, circling the table as he spoke. "You had a power of attorney, outdated or not. The paperwork was prepared by a title agency. You relied on them. The emotional narrative sells. If we lean into your strained relationship with your father, show the court a young man trying to find his own way, we can at least force a settlement." Brandon's jaw tightened. "I don't want a settlement. I want that ranch." Craig stopped pacing. "That's not going to happen. But what you might get is a financial negotiation. He doesn't want this dragged through the mud. That gives us something to bargain with." But Brandon didn't want a bargain. What he wanted was control. He wanted to be seen as the man who built something new from something old, who didn't just inherit his father's land but transformed it into something greater. That dream was crumbling, and all he had now was a narrative of mistakes and excuses. He stared out the office window, jaw clenched. Back at the ranch, Frank prepared for the next stage in silence. He knew the court hearings would come soon. Depositions. Possibly even press. But he was ready. Every document had been duplicated, stored, and secured. The Veterans Foundation had assigned legal counsel to co-defend the trust. Harold's office had secured expert witnesses on land transfers and document forgeries. The trap had been laid long before Brandon realized he was even being hunted. Still, it wasn't satisfaction that Frank felt. It was something colder. Something heavier. His fight wasn't just against his son, it was against the shadow of what Brandon had become. And as the ranch remained frozen in the half-state between peace and conflict, Frank couldn't help but think back to the days when Brandon used to sit on the porch beside him, legs dangling off the steps, asking about the cattle, or the crops, or the changing seasons. Those days were gone. This Brandon, the one fighting for what he tried to steal, was someone else entirely. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the field, Frank stood on the porch watching the road. A silver car slowed at the gate. Not Brandon's truck. It was a rental. Frank recognized the figure behind the wheel, Allison Reyes, McKinley's legal representative. She stepped out, heels clicking on gravel, and approached the gate slowly. "Mr. Miller," she called, voice steady. "I'm not here to argue. I just need a conversation." Frank studied her a moment, then gestured toward the open gate. She walked up the steps, handed him a sealed envelope. "Mr. McKinley is withdrawing from the purchase. He's filing his own claim against your son. We've also provided all communications and documents we received from him. You'll find we were misled as much as you." Frank took the envelope without a word, opened it slowly, and glanced at the contents. "We won't pursue damages," Reyes added, "but we are cooperating fully with the investigation." Frank nodded. "You should." Reyes paused. "Your son, he's going to face real consequences. Possibly criminal. Are you ready for that?" Frank didn't answer right away. Then, without looking at her, he said, "He chose the road. Now he has to walk it." Reyes left without another word. Frank stood in the silence that followed, envelope in hand, and watched the horizon. The sky was bruised with twilight, and the wind carried the scent of mesquite and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a lone cow bellowed. The ranch, despite all, was still alive. Still his. But Brandon was approaching a point of no return. And Frank, though hardened by age and betrayal, still felt the slow ache of a father who didn't just want to win. He wanted to understand how it had come to this. The courthouse was unusually quiet that morning. Outside, the flags barely stirred in the breeze, and the heat had already settled on the pavement in thick, unmoving waves. Brandon Miller adjusted his collar, uncomfortable in a suit he had borrowed from his attorney's closet. It didn't quite fit right across the shoulders, and the sleeves were half an inch too short. Still, he wore it with as much confidence as he could muster, knowing full well this wasn't just any hearing, it was his last chance to control the story. Craig Hollingsworth walked beside him, expression unreadable. The lawyer had spent the last 72 hours crafting a legal defense that leaned heavily on Brandon's emotional vulnerability, stress, and the alleged gray area of the outdated power of attorney. They had prepared a strategy of selective acknowledgement, admit just enough to sound honest, deny enough to avoid direct fault. Inside the courtroom, Frank was already seated. He didn't look at Brandon as he entered. Dressed in dark denim and a clean white shirt, Frank sat like a man watching a storm he'd seen coming from miles away. On the bench beside him sat Harold Denton, calm as ever, tapping his pen quietly against a yellow legal pad. The judge entered, a tall, lean woman with sharp eyes and no time for performance. She didn't greet the room beyond a clipped, "Good morning," before she launched into the first motions of the day. The hearing was not for a verdict, yet, but for argument, evidence presentation, and the judge's determination on whether to elevate the matter to trial or dismiss based on what had already been filed. Brandon's attorney opened with his prepared lines. He spoke of a son left to navigate financial confusion after his mother's death, of an unclear legal arrangement signed years ago, of pressure and desperation compounded by isolation. Brandon sat stiffly, nodding at the right times, letting the lawyer carry the weight of the narrative. "He acted not out of greed, Your Honor," Hollingsworth said, "but out of misunderstanding, compounded by poor advice and legal ambiguity. We do not deny errors occurred, but we ask the court to view them through the lens of confusion, not malicious intent." The judge took notes without expression. Then it was Harold's turn. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, held the affidavit from the Veteran Support Foundation in one hand, and laid out the events in stark, chronological order. "This is not a case of confusion, Your Honor. This is a calculated act. The trust transfer was executed, documented, and filed properly. The defendant, Mr. Miller's son, was aware he no longer had full rights to the property. He used a forged notary signature. He misrepresented the authority he claimed to have. He engaged in deliberate fraud. He placed a folder on the table. Inside are transcribed recordings, bank transfer timelines, and a signed statement from the fake notary used during the transaction. That individual, by the way, has since confessed and is cooperating with authorities. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Let me be clear," Harold continued. "This was not the desperate move of a confused son. This was an organized deception, designed to move millions of dollars across state lines under the assumption that the victim, his father, was too old or too weary to stop him." Brandon shifted in his seat. For the first time, the mask cracked. His gaze dropped to the floor, jaw clenched. Camille, seated in the gallery behind him, didn't offer any expression of support. She kept her eyes on her phone the entire time, responding to messages that had nothing to do with court proceedings. The judge called a recess. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Brandon paced in tight circles. He stopped suddenly and turned to Craig. "This isn't going the way you said it would." Craig didn't flinch. "Because you lied to me," he replied. "You told me there was no paper trail. No recordings. You didn't mention the foundation. You left me blind." Brandon's voice dropped. "Then fix it." Craig exhaled through his nose, tired. "There's no fixing it. The best we can do is negotiate a settlement. Maybe if we offer to return the funds, cooperate with the buyers and the state, they'll avoid pressing criminal charges." Brandon slammed his fist against the wall. "No. I'm not walking away from this with nothing." Craig gave him a long, cold look. "You're lucky if you walk away from this at all." Back inside, the judge reconvened. She turned to Brandon directly for the first time. "Mr. Miller," she said, "you may speak if you wish. This is not a trial, but your statement may inform my next ruling." Brandon stood, adjusted the too small suit, and approached the microphone. He cleared his throat, eyes sweeping the courtroom. "I didn't mean to hurt my father," he began, voice thin. "I made mistakes. But I believed I had a right to the land. It's my family's land. My mother died there. I grew up there. It belonged to all of us." He hesitated, glanced at Frank. "I thought I could do something better with it. Build something new. Something that made the family proud. Maybe I went too far, but I didn't do it to steal. I did it because I thought he'd given up." Frank didn't respond. He didn't move. His silence was louder than any rebuttal. The judge listened carefully, then made her ruling. "This court finds sufficient evidence to elevate the matter to trial," she said. "However, in light of the submitted documentation and witness cooperation, I am also authorizing preliminary restitution orders and freezing all connected accounts until further notice. Mr. Miller, Brandon Miller, you are to return any disbursed funds to the court registry. Further actions regarding criminal charges will proceed under a separate jurisdiction." The gavel fell. The room emptied slowly. Brandon remained at the defense table, stunned. Craig packed up quietly. Camille had already slipped out the back door, never once turning around. Frank walked past without a word. But just as he reached the exit, he paused. Without turning around, he said loud enough for Brandon to hear. "I didn't give up, son. You just stopped looking." Then he walked out, the echo of his boots on the polished floor fading behind him. 3 days after the courthouse hearing, the Miller Ranch remained still beneath the weight of a dry, windless sky. The kind of stillness that stretched out time and made even the animals quieter than usual. Frank spent the early morning in the equipment shed, replacing the oil on the old John Deere tractor. Grease coated his hands, and sweat trickled down his back, but he welcomed the solitude of the task. After the hearing, the calls started coming, from neighbors, old friends, and a few reporters who had somehow caught wind of the case. He ignored every one of them. He hadn't heard from Brandon. Not directly. There had been no apology, no letter, not even a message. And Frank didn't expect one. His focus now was on rebuilding trust, not with his son, but with the land itself. There was damage, even if not visible. Fences needed mending, operations paused for too long had to be restored, and the local suppliers had started asking careful questions before extending new credit lines. Betrayal had a way of rippling far beyond its first impact. Around noon, as Frank was brushing down one of the horses, he heard the low crunch of tires on gravel. Not the sound of a delivery truck or a neighbor's pickup, this was slower, uncertain. He stepped out of the stable, eyes narrowing as he saw the familiar outline of Brandon's black truck easing toward the front gate. Frank didn't move. The truck stopped. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and Brandon stepped out slowly, dressed in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, no longer wearing the polished arrogance that had marked his earlier visits. He stood just outside the gate, hands visible at his sides, as if approaching something sacred. Frank stayed by the barn, arms folded across his chest. He said nothing. Brandon cleared his throat. "I know I don't have the right," he began, "but I needed to come." Frank didn't respond. "I got the court notice," Brandon continued. "Funds are being transferred back. McKinley's people already served me their lawsuit. It's all unraveling, just like you said it would." Frank finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "I didn't say it would unravel. I made sure it did." Brandon nodded, eyes cast down. "I know." A long silence settled between them. "I'm not here to beg," Brandon said after a moment. "And I'm not here to pretend nothing happened. I messed up. Worse than I ever have in my life. I was stupid, selfish. I told myself I was building something new, but really I was just trying to run away from what I never understood." Frank walked slowly toward the gate, each step deliberate. When he reached the edge of the fence, he rested his hand on the top rail and looked at his son, really looked at him. Brandon's face was thinner, more drawn. The confidence he once carried had been replaced by something more fragile, more real. Brandon took a small step closer. "I've lost everything. Camille's gone. Investors pulled out. My name's getting dragged through the mud. And the worst part is, I earned it." Frank didn't speak. "I drove all night," Brandon went on. "Didn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mom. About the way she used to talk about this place, about how you two built it. I didn't get it then. But I think I do now." He hesitated. "I want to come back. Not to take anything. Just to help. If you'll let me." Frank let out a slow breath. "This place isn't a hotel, Brandon. You don't just check in when the world gets hard." "I know," Brandon replied. "But I also know that nothing out there is real. Not like this. I kept trying to prove I was better than this ranch, better than you. But I'm not. I don't know who I am anymore, but I know I can't figure it out alone." The quiet stretched again. Then Frank said, "You remember where the bunkhouse is?" Brandon looked up, surprised. "Yeah. You'll sleep there," Frank said. "No special treatment. You'll eat after the animals do. 5 o'clock wake-ups. One screw-up, you're gone." Brandon nodded. "Understood." Frank opened the gate. "You start tomorrow." Brandon stepped inside the property. For the first time in months, his boots touched the soil not as a trespasser, not as a thief, but as a man facing the full weight of his choices. He followed Frank to the bunkhouse without another word. Inside, it was bare. A cot, a chair, an old dresser. Dust lingered in the corners, and the smell of cedar and old leather hung in the air. Brandon dropped his duffel on the floor and sat on the bed, exhaling slowly. He was back, but not restored. That would take time. That evening, Frank sat on the porch, iced tea in hand. The sun dropped low, casting long shadows over the land. He heard Brandon out behind the barn, cleaning out the feed bins as instructed. The boy didn't complain. Didn't ask questions. Just worked. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. Frank looked out across the land, the familiar fields bathed in golden light. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was holding the weight alone. And though he didn't trust Brandon fully, he allowed himself one small hope. That the boy who tried to take everything might finally learn what it meant to earn something. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the morning of Brandon Miller's trial. It wasn't just lawyers and court staff this time, it was local ranchers, reporters from regional outlets, and even a few quiet neighbors who remembered Brandon as a boy. Word had traveled fast across the rural counties. This wasn't just a fraud case, it had become something more symbolic, a collision of generations, legacy, and betrayal, unfolding under the fluorescent lights of the state courthouse. Frank arrived alone, just after sunrise. He wore a dark suit he hadn't pulled from the closet since Lillian's funeral. He didn't wear it for formality, but for respect, not for the court, but for the land that had been nearly stolen under his nose. As he sat on the bench behind the prosecution's table, he didn't look at Brandon, who was already seated with his attorney. Frank focused instead on the judge, the jury, and the binder of evidence in front of Harold Denton. Brandon sat quietly at the defense table, hands folded, the tension in his shoulders visible even from a distance. His face had changed over the last few weeks. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something leaner, more bruised. His suit fit better this time, but his posture made it clear, he was no longer playing the part of the innovator or the future-minded son. He was a man on the edge of losing everything, including his freedom. The judge entered. Proceedings began. The first hour was procedural. Jury selection, opening instructions, an outline of the charges, fraud, forgery, falsification of legal documents, attempted illegal sale of protected charitable property. The courtroom listened in near silence as the prosecution laid out the story from the beginning, not just with paperwork, but with audio recordings, digital transcripts, and a timeline that painted Brandon's scheme with unforgiving clarity. Harold Denton presented the case with the precision of a man who had spent his life disassembling lies. He walked the jury through Brandon's planning, the falsified notary signature, the conversations with McKinley's real estate team, and the forged emails that had accompanied the sale agreement. He presented the Veterans Foundation documentation and showed the court how the land had legally changed hands before Brandon's unauthorized deal. Then, Denton played the recordings. Brandon's voice filled the courtroom, confident, dismissive, scheming. He won't be a problem. He still thinks he owns the place. I've got the papers. It's signed. Legally, I can push it through. You don't get it. He doesn't even know it's gone. Each clip was short, but none needed to be long. The tone alone said everything the jury needed to hear. By mid-morning, the defense made its opening. Craig Hollingsworth didn't deny the recordings or the transactions, he leaned instead into Brandon's emotional unraveling. He spoke of pressure, loss, desperation, and the psychological toll of a father-son relationship built on silence and misunderstanding. Brandon Miller did not act with malice, Craig said. He acted with fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of failure, fear that his father no longer saw him as part of the family's future. Did he act unwisely? Yes. Did he act unlawfully? The facts are complicated. But the intent was not criminal, it was emotional. The prosecution rebutted quickly. Emotional confusion does not excuse organized fraud. Wanting to be seen is not the same as having the right to steal. Frank listened without flinching. He hadn't come to be vindicated. He had come to see truth prevail, however it unfolded. In the afternoon, Frank was called to the stand. He stepped up slowly, took the oath, and settled into the witness chair. Denton asked only a few questions, nothing sensational, just fact-based. Mr. Miller, did you authorize your son to sell your ranch? No, Frank said simply. Were you aware he was negotiating a sale? No. Did you file any legal transfer of property prior to the sale? Yes. 75%, placed into a charitable trust for the Veterans Support Foundation. The rest remained under my control. Was your son aware of this arrangement? He was not. Did you ever give him verbal permission to conduct legal transactions on your behalf after the death of your wife? No. Only temporary medical and estate decisions. Nothing related to real estate. Thank you, Mr. Miller. As Frank stepped down, he looked briefly at Brandon. Their eyes met for only a second, but that second was enough. Brandon's gaze dropped. No anger. No defense. Just shame. The defense called Brandon next. He hesitated before rising. The room was still as he walked to the stand, raised his hand, and sat beneath the gaze of judge and jury. Craig's questions were soft at first. Can you describe what led to your decision to move forward with the sale? Brandon spoke quietly. I thought my father was done. He barely spoke. He kept things from me. I thought he didn't care anymore. And the paperwork? The signature? Brandon hesitated. I thought I could get it through without trouble. I thought he wouldn't fight it. And the buyer? McKinley? I made the deal myself. I wanted the money to start something new. I didn't think he'd ever know the truth. And now? Brandon looked at the jury. Now I know I was wrong. All of it. I don't deserve the ranch. I don't even deserve his name. The courtroom held its breath. The prosecution declined to cross-examine. The facts spoke for themselves. By day's end, the jury was sent to deliberate. Frank waited in the hallway, sipping cold water from a paper cup, while Harold reviewed the transcript. It took only 90 minutes. The courtroom filled again. The jury returned. The foreman stood. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of forgery, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted illegal property transfer, we find the defendant guilty. The judge did not sentence immediately. She scheduled a hearing 2 weeks out to allow for financial assessments and sentencing arguments. But the message was clear: Brandon would not walk free. As the courtroom emptied, Frank stood to leave. Brandon, now surrounded by court officers, looked up once more. He didn't speak. Neither did Frank. But before he walked out, Frank placed a folded piece of paper on the defense table, a copy of the deed showing the ranch, safely returned to its rightful ownership, with a note scribbled beneath. Some things you build. Others you protect. Learn the difference. Then he walked out into the fading afternoon light, the land waiting for him as it always had. The morning mist clung to the tall grass like a second skin as Frank stood at the edge of the southern pasture, staring out over the land that had nearly been lost. The ranch had returned to its rhythm, cattle grazing in the distance, barn doors creaking open with the wind, and the steady hum of work rising with the sun. Yet beneath the surface, something still lingered. The courtroom verdict had brought legal closure, but it hadn't touched the deeper wound between father and son. Frank hadn't spoken to Brandon since the trial. He hadn't visited the county jail, hadn't returned the letter Brandon had mailed through his attorney. The note had been short. Just a few sentences: I don't expect forgiveness. I only want to say thank you, for not letting me ruin everything. I hope one day you'll understand why I thought I had to do it. I didn't see what I had until it was too late. Frank had read it once. Then again. Then folded it carefully and placed it inside Lillian's Bible, the one that stayed on the mantel, untouched since the day she passed. 2 weeks later, on the day of Brandon's sentencing, Frank appeared in court again, not out of obligation but of something more complicated, not forgiveness, not yet, but a reckoning with what it meant to be a father. The courtroom was quieter this time. Fewer spectators, no media. Just the necessary people, lawyers, a few deputies, the judge, and Brandon. He stood at the defense table with no handcuffs, though the guards stood close. He looked thinner, paler. But his head was held higher, as if finally understanding that accepting the weight of his actions was part of the price. The judge addressed him with the same measured tone she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Mr. Miller, she said, you have been found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and forgery, each of which could carry significant prison time under state law. However, the court has received an unusual request from the victim, your father. Brandon's brow furrowed slightly, uncertain. The judge turned to her clerk, who handed her a document. She read from it aloud. The victim has requested a full suspension of the criminal sentence under the condition that the defendant agrees to a 2-year period of supervised restitution, to be served by working full-time on the property he attempted to sell, under direct supervision of the property's owner. The courtroom was silent. Frank stood. "I submitted that request," he said, addressing the court. "Not because I think he doesn't deserve punishment. He does. But I believe punishment without purpose is wasted. He's going to serve that time, not behind bars, but out there, on the land he tried to give away. And he's going to learn what it means to earn back trust." Brandon looked over at his father, eyes wide. He wasn't sure if it was mercy or something harder. Maybe both. The judge studied Frank's face, then turned back to Brandon. "Do you accept these terms?" Brandon nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then so ordered," she said, banging the gavel. Court adjourned. Afterward, as the courthouse emptied, Brandon approached Frank slowly in the hallway. He looked smaller up close, like the years had caught up to him all at once. But there was no defiance in his voice when he spoke. "You didn't have to do that." Frank looked at him, calm but resolute. "No. But you're still my son. And if you're willing to work, I'll give you a place to do it." "Nothing more." Brandon nodded. The next morning, before dawn, Brandon returned to the ranch. No luggage, no car, just a duffel bag over one shoulder and the look of someone who had been hollowed out and rebuilt into something quieter. Frank met him at the gate, handed him a set of gloves, and motioned toward the feed shed. "You know the schedule," Frank said. "You keep it, or you leave." "I'll keep it," Brandon said. For weeks, they didn't talk beyond what was necessary. Frank gave instructions, Brandon followed them. He mucked stalls, repaired irrigation lines, hauled supplies, and ran fencing, not once asking for a break or a change in tasks. He lived in the bunkhouse, ate alone most nights, and worked until his hands were blistered and raw. But he never complained. One evening, just as the sun was dipping below the hills, Frank walked into the barn to find Brandon finishing up repairs on a hay baler. His face and shirt were streaked with grease. A flashlight hung from a nail, casting harsh light on the tired lines around his eyes. Frank stood in the doorway. "You've been showing up," he said. "Every day." Brandon didn't look up right away. Then he nodded. "That's the least I can do." Frank crossed his arms, watching the younger man tighten the last bolt. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we had," Frank said, voice lower. "But I know this land doesn't forget when someone tries." Brandon turned then, eyes meeting his father's. "I'm not here for forgiveness, Dad. I'm here because this is the only place that ever meant anything. And I want to prove I can be part of it, even if it takes years." Frank nodded once. "Then we keep going." He turned and left, leaving Brandon in the barn, standing in that circle of flashlight glow, the silence no longer cold, just full of work left to be done. As summer edged into early autumn, the ranch pulsed with new rhythm. Brandon rose before the sun, worked through heat and dust, and spoke little, but what he said, he meant. He began to meet the neighbors again, though most still watched him with narrowed eyes. A few offered cautious greetings. A couple brought extra equipment when they heard he was digging out a new irrigation line. Word was spreading, as it always did in places like theirs, that Frank Miller had given his son a second chance, but that chance had to be earned, day by day, acre by acre. The community didn't quite understand it. Some whispered that Frank was being too soft. Others admired him more for it. Frank didn't care what they thought. He watched the sun rise each morning with the same steady eyes. And each day Brandon walked out into the fields, Frank didn't see the man who betrayed him, he saw the man who came back. That, he figured, was a start. The Texas sun spared no one, not even in October. The mornings were crisp, but by midday, the heat clung to the skin, turning sweat into dust and effort into exhaustion. Brandon Miller, once a man who had walked polished office halls and pitched startups in air-conditioned cafes, now woke at 4:30 in the morning. By 5, he was in the fields, shovel in hand, or hauling sacks of feed from the supply shed to the troughs. His body had grown leaner, his muscles taut with daily use, and his hands, once soft and unblemished, were now thick with calluses, his nails permanently rimmed in dirt. Frank watched it all without comment. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't the cold silence of resentment anymore. It was something functional. Working silence. A language made of nods, short sentences, and mutual understanding. When Frank gave instructions, Brandon listened. When Brandon completed a task, Frank inspected the result. No praise was given, but none was expected. Brandon knew what failure looked like now. He had seen it from every angle, in courtrooms, in Camille's absence, in the thinly veiled scorn of old neighbors. But here, in this place he once tried to abandon, he had found something truer, that respect doesn't come from ownership, it comes from contribution. In the first few weeks, the ranch hands kept their distance. They had known Frank for years, and most had been skeptical when Brandon returned. Miguel, the foreman, had even pulled Frank aside one afternoon. "You really trust him here, boss?" he asked. Frank hadn't answered with a yes or no. He just said, "He's here to work, not to be trusted." Miguel nodded and kept his crew in line. But by the end of the first month, it was Brandon who stayed late when the water line burst in the east pasture. It was Brandon who volunteered to take the night shift when a cow went into labor. And it was Brandon who walked into town to replace a snapped belt on the hay loader, paid for it out of his own pocket, and returned before anyone noticed it was missing. The hands began to take notice. It was a Sunday when the change became visible. After morning chores, Frank and Brandon sat on the back porch with iced tea, not speaking, just watching the sun drift higher. One of the ranch trucks rolled up, and a familiar voice called out. "Brought you something, Frank?" It was Carl, a longtime neighbor who'd stopped visiting after the trial. He stepped out of the truck holding a metal toolbox. Frank stood, wary. Carl looked between father and son, then set the box on the porch rail. "Got that bearing press you needed," he said. "Thought maybe the boy here could put it to use." Brandon nodded. "Thank you, sir." Carl nodded back but looked to Frank. "Ain't here to forgive. But I can recognize when a man's trying." Frank didn't respond, but his silence, this time, didn't push Carl away. That afternoon, Brandon used the tool to fix the hay baler again. When it worked on the first test run, Frank gave the slightest nod. Brandon noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. In the evenings, Brandon began asking quiet questions. Not about forgiveness. About the ranch. About how Frank had managed certain operations during the drought in the 90s. How he balanced livestock numbers against fluctuating grain prices. Frank answered in pieces. It wasn't warmth. It was investment. One night, as they watched the horses return to the corral, Brandon spoke without turning. "I used to think this place was a prison," he said. Frank didn't look at him. "That's 'cause you never built a fence that held." Another silence passed between them. Then Brandon said, "I don't expect you to forget what I did." Frank nodded. "I won't. But I hope one day," Brandon added, "you'll believe I became someone else because of it." Frank leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees. Becoming someone else don't mean anything unless the work matches the words. "I know," Brandon said. "That's why I'm still here." And he was. Through stormy nights and dry days. Through exhaustion and doubt. Through silence. The next week, Frank walked into the local hardware store. The owner, an old friend named Lou, raised an eyebrow. "Been hearin' your boy's still stickin' it out." Frank picked up a box of nails, studied the label. "He is. Had a customer say they saw him fix a fence in a storm last week. Alone. That true?" Frank shrugged. "Fence needed fixin', dot." Lou smiled. "Man don't do that unless he means it." Frank paid in cash and left without saying more. Back at the ranch, he found Brandon in the tool shed, replacing the air filter on the generator. It was covered in grime, and Brandon was elbow-deep in grease. "You finished the west line?" Frank asked. "Almost. Had to dig out a buried post. Was rotted through." Frank stepped closer. "Check the east fence after this. Cattle been rubbing the same stretch all week. Won't hold." "Got it." As Frank turned to leave, he paused. "Good job on the loader." Brandon looked up. Frank didn't repeat it. He just walked back into the fading light, the wind carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. That single acknowledgement carried more weight than any applause. Because silence had taught Brandon what noise never had. That trust, once broken, was earned not in grand gestures but in the repetition of honest work. That a man wasn't measured by how he fell, but how he showed up, every day, after the fall. And so the days continued. The seasons prepared to shift. The ranch endured. And Brandon, at last, had begun to understand what it meant to stay. The sky was still pink with dawn when Frank Miller stepped out of the house, tugging on his worn leather gloves. The crisp air carried the scent of dry hay and earth, and the distant sound of a rooster broke the morning silence. It had been 2 years since Brandon had returned to the ranch, and in that time, things had changed, not in some grand cinematic way, but in the quiet, persistent manner of real life. Fences had been mended. Machinery repaired. Cattle sold. Land rotated. And a father and son, once fractured beyond recognition, had learned to coexist. Now, that 2-year commitment was nearly over. Brandon's court-ordered restitution had run its course. What had begun as punishment had, slowly, become something else. A lifestyle. A discipline. A reconciliation not born of apologies, but of effort. Frank poured himself coffee in the kitchen, same routine as always, and watched through the window as Brandon walked toward the far barn, the oldest one on the property, weather-beaten and leaning slightly, but still standing. Brandon had asked to meet him there that morning, without saying why. Frank didn't need a reason. He put on his hat, picked up his coffee, and followed. When he arrived, Brandon was already inside, sweeping out the dust and clearing away stacked planks of warped wood. The morning light filtered through the slats in the walls, casting long lines of shadow and gold across the dirt floor. Brandon looked up when Frank stepped through the door. "I figured this one's gone long enough without attention," Brandon said, motioning to the old structure. Frank glanced around. "It's been standing since '58. Hasn't fallen yet." "Yeah, well," Brandon said with a quiet smile, "that's no reason to ignore it." Frank leaned against the doorway, sipping his coffee. Brandon set down the broom and wiped his hands on his jeans. "There's something I want to say," Brandon began. "And I'm not great with speeches, so I'll just say it plain." Frank waited. "I came back here thinking I could fix what I broke by working hard. And maybe I did some of that. But what I've learned is, this place never needed fixing. I did." He paused, exhaled. "I don't want to leave when the 2 years are up. I don't want to go back to that life I thought I wanted. If there's still a place for me here, not just out of obligation, but because you believe I belong, I'd stay. And I'll keep earning it, however long that takes." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then stepped forward and set his coffee down on an old feed barrel. Without saying a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a manila envelope. He held it out to Brandon. Brandon hesitated, then took it. Inside were a series of documents, legal papers, clearly official. At the top of the first page, his name was printed in bold. Transfer of ownership, partial stake, Miller Ranch Holdings. He looked up, confused. "This is 25%, Frank said simply. "Legal. Clean. Recorded." Brandon blinked, stunned. "Why?" Frank picked up his coffee again. "Because you earned it. Not through blood. Not through the name. But through the work. Through staying. through not quitting when it would have been easier to walk. Brandon sat on the edge of an old hay bale, the papers trembling slightly in his hands. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," Frank replied. "Just keep showing up." A silence settled between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled. It wasn't awkward, it was weighty, like the pause between a season ending and another beginning. Frank walked over to the far corner of the barn and kicked at a loose board. "Floor needs reinforcing. We'll have to lift half of this section if we're gonna use it for storage again." Brandon stood, folding the papers carefully back into the envelope. "I'll start on it tomorrow." Frank nodded. "You'll start on it today. Storm's coming this weekend. Don't want that roof giving way." Brandon smiled. "You got it." They spent the rest of the morning in the barn, measuring beams, hauling new lumber from the shed, and marking repairs. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. The silence between them had changed once again, from function, to understanding, to partnership. As they worked, Brandon occasionally glanced around at the barn's old interior, at the initials carved into the beam near the door from when he was 10, at the faded photograph of his mother still pinned to the wall above the old workbench, at the signs of time and memory stitched into every inch of the space. This barn, the final one, as Frank had once called it, wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol, of history, of family, of resilience. Later that afternoon, they stepped out into the fading light, sweat-drenched and exhausted. Brandon wiped his brow and looked over the property. The cattle were calm. The fences held. The air was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds preparing for evening. "I never thought I'd find peace here," Brandon said softly. Frank didn't look at him. "Peace isn't found. It's made. Same way you build a ranch. One fence post at a time." Brandon nodded. They walked back toward the house, side by side. The land stretched out in every direction, wild and beautiful, worn and sacred. The ranch had survived betrayal, courtrooms, silence, and shame. But it had also become something stronger in the end. Not just because of the work done, but because of the men who stayed to do it. Frank Miller had built a legacy. Brandon Miller had learned how to protect one. And somewhere in the middle, between barns and bruises, between pride and humility, they had found their way back to each other.